I, 35M, find myself in a complicated situation that's stirring up a lot of old pain. 12 years ago, when I was 23, my father kicked me out of our house. The reason? I caught my stepmom stealing money from his wallet and reported it to him. Let me provide some context. My mom passed away when I was 10 after a long battle with cancer. Those years were tough on all of us, but especially on my dad. He threw himself into work after she died, leaving me to mostly fend for myself. I grew up fast, learning to cook basic meals and do my own laundry by the time I was 12. Dad remarried when I was 14 to a woman I'll call Linda. From day one, Linda made it crystal clear she didn't like me. At first, I thought it was just the typical awkwardness of blended families, but as time went on, it became obvious that her dislike ran deep. Linda would constantly criticize everything I did. My grades were never good enough, my room was never clean enough, I was too loud, too quiet, too this, too that. She'd compare me unfavorably to her own kids, my step-siblings, who were younger and, in her eyes, much better behaved. What hurt the most was how she'd try to turn my dad against me. She'd wait until he came home from work, tired and distracted, then casually mention how I'd acted out that day, or how I'd said something disrespectful. Half the time, these were complete fabrications. The other half, they were gross exaggerations of normal teenage behavior. As I got older, things only got worse. Linda would forget to buy food I liked when she did the grocery shopping. She'd conveniently lose my laundry in the wash, leaving me without clean clothes for school. Once, she even hid my textbooks the night before a big exam, claiming she'd tidied up and couldn't remember where she put them. When I tried to talk to my dad about it, he'd brush it off. He'd say I was being dramatic or not trying hard enough to get along with Linda. I think he was so desperate to make his new marriage work that he couldn't see what was really going on. I started working part-time jobs as soon as I could, first mowing lawns and babysitting, then at a local grocery store. I needed money to buy my own things and save up for college. Linda hated this because it meant she had less control over me. She couldn't threaten to withhold allowance or take away things she'd bought me because I was providing for myself. She'd try to guilt me into giving her my money, saying I should contribute to the household expenses. I refused, knowing she'd just spend it on herself or her kids. This led to even more tension in the house. Despite all this, I managed to do well in school and got accepted to a good college. I threw myself into my studies, grateful for the escape from home. But every time I came back for breaks, the cycle would start all over again. The final straw came the summer I was 23. I was home from college, working a summer job, and preparing for my final year. I noticed my dad seemed stressed about money. He was working longer hours and arguing with Linda more often about expenses. One day, I was in my room when I saw Linda sneaking into their bedroom while Dad was in the shower. Something about her behavior seemed off, so I quietly followed and peeked in. To my shock, I saw her rifling through my dad's wallet, pulling out cash and stuffing it into her pocket. This wasn't the first time I'd suspected her of stealing, but it was the first time I had concrete proof. I waited until Linda left for work, then sat down with my dad to tell him what I'd seen. Instead of believing me, he exploded. He accused me of lying to cause problems in his marriage. We had a huge argument where years of pent-up frustration came pouring out. I told him everything Linda had done over the years, how she'd mistreated me, and how he'd always taken her side. I begged him to open his eyes and see what was really going on. But my dad got angrier and angrier. He said I was ungrateful for everything he and Linda had done for me. He accused me of being jealous of my step-siblings and trying to sabotage his happiness. Finally, red-faced and shaking, he told me to get out of his house and not come back until I was ready to apologize and treat Linda with respect. I was stunned. I'd expected him to be upset, but I never thought he'd choose Linda over me like that. In that moment, something broke between us. I packed a backpack with some clothes and my laptop and left that day. The next few months were the hardest of my life. I couch-surfed with friends, worked multiple part-time jobs, and barely scraped by. I was determined to finish college, but there were days when I wasn't sure how I'd make it. During this time, I met an amazing girl named Sarah. We had a class together and started studying at the same cafe. She noticed I was always there, from open to close, and eventually asked if I was okay. Something about her genuine concern broke through the walls I'd built up, and I found myself telling her everything. Sarah was incredibly supportive. She helped me find resources on campus for students in difficult situations. She'd bring me home-cooked meals and let me do laundry at her apartment. Most importantly, she listened without judgment, and gave me a safe space to process my emotions. We started dating a few months later. Sarah became my rock, helping me through some really dark times when I was tempted to give up. With her support and my own determination, I managed to graduate on time with a degree in computer science. Over the next few years, I worked hard to build a life for myself. I started in an entry-level IT job and worked my way up. Sarah and I moved in together, then got married 3 years ago. We bought a small house in a nice neighborhood. We're not rich by any means, but we're comfortable and happy. Throughout all of this, I hadn't heard from my dad or Linda. I'd tried to reach out a couple times in the early years, leaving voicemails and sending emails, but they were ignored. Eventually, I accepted that they didn't want me in their lives and focused on moving forward. Then, out of the blue last week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was my dad. His voice sounded old and tired, nothing like the strong, confident man I remembered. He told me that Linda had left him 2 years ago, taking most of their savings with her. Turns out, she'd been stealing and gambling for years, just like I'd suspected. Dad lost the house and has been struggling ever since. He's 65 now and having health issues, so he can't work much anymore. He said he was sorry for not believing me and for how he treated me. He told me he needs help and asked if he could come stay with us for a while. He has nowhere else to go. I was stunned. All those old feelings of hurt and anger came rushing back. I told him I needed time to think and hung up. When I told Sarah what happened, she was sympathetic to my feelings, but also felt bad for my dad. She thinks we should at least meet with him and see how we can help. She pointed out that he's old and alone now, and that holding on to anger might hurt me more in the long run. The thing is, I don't want to help him. I remember how hard those years were after he kicked me out. How I had to scrape and struggle for everything while he and Linda lived comfortably. How he never once reached out or tried to make amends until he needed something from me. At the same time, I feel guilty. He's still my dad, and he's old and alone now. But the thought of having him in our home, in the life I built without him, makes me feel sick. I worked so hard to create a peaceful, happy life with Sarah. I'm afraid having him here will bring back all the stress and drama of the past. I've been considering looking into assisted living facilities or senior apartments for him. That way, he'd have a place to live and some care, but wouldn't be directly involved in our daily lives. But I'm not sure if that's the right thing to do either. Part of me thinks I don't owe him anything after how he treated me. Another part feels like I should be the bigger person and help him now that he's in need. I'm torn between my lingering resentment and my sense of familial duty. Am I the asshole for not wanting to help my dad after all this time? Should I let him stay with us like he wants? Or is finding him a separate place to live a fair compromise? I feel like I'm damned if I do, and damned if I don't. Update 1. Thank you all for your responses to my original post. I've read through every comment and really appreciate the different perspectives. I wanted to give an update on what's happened since then. After a lot of discussion with Sarah, we decided to meet with my dad in person. We felt we needed to see him face to face to really gauge the situation. We arranged to have lunch at a neutral location, a small cafe near our home. Seeing my dad again after 12 years was intense. He's aged a lot more than I expected. His hair is completely gray now, his face lined with wrinkles I don't remember. He walks with a slight limp and his hands shake a little. He looked nervous when he saw us, which was strange. I'd always remembered him as this confident, almost intimidating figure. We sat down and ordered coffee. At first, it was painfully awkward. None of us really knew what to say. Finally, my dad broke the silence. He started by apologizing again for what happened all those years ago. He admitted that he'd been blind to Linda's true nature and had chosen her over me repeatedly. He said he regretted it every day since I left. He then went into more detail about what had happened with Linda. Apparently, her gambling addiction had spiraled out of control over the years. She wasn't just taking cash from his wallet, she was draining their bank accounts, maxing out credit cards, and even taking out loans in my dad's name. Dad said he'd been in denial for a long time, making excuses for the missing money and believing Linda's lies. It wasn't until he found some incriminating bank statements that he finally confronted her. When he did, she left, taking what was left of their savings. He tried to recover financially, but between the debt Linda left behind and his declining health, he couldn't keep up. He lost the house about a year ago and has been staying with an old friend since then. But his friend is selling the house, and moving to be closer to his own kids, so Dad needs to find a new place to live. I asked him why he never reached out before now. He looked ashamed and said he was too proud. He thought he could fix things on his own. It was only when he realized he had nowhere else to turn that he finally swallowed his pride and called me. Throughout all this, Sarah was amazing. She asked thoughtful questions and showed genuine concern for my dad's situation. She asked about his health, his daily routine, what kind of support system he had. I could tell it meant a lot to him to have someone show interest in his well-being. As for me, I found myself feeling conflicted. On one hand, seeing my dad so broken down and hearing his apology stirred up some of the affection I used to feel for him. I remembered good times from my childhood, him teaching me to ride a bike, cheering at my little league games, helping me with math homework. For a moment I could see glimpses of the dad I used to adore. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the memory of how he'd treated me. The pain of being kicked out, of struggling alone for years, still felt raw. I remembered nights spent wondering where I'd sleep, days where I could barely afford to eat. I remembered checking my phone obsessively, hoping for a message from him that never came. We didn't make any decisions that day. I told Dad we needed time to discuss things and figure out what we could realistically do to help. He seemed disappointed but understood. As we were leaving, he hugged me. It was awkward and stiff, but I could feel him trembling slightly. It hit me then how scared and alone he must feel. After he left, Sarah and I had a long talk. She pointed out that while my dad had made huge mistakes, he seemed genuinely remorseful. She also reminded me that holding on to anger would only hurt me in the long run. She shared a story about her own grandmother, who had cut ties with the family for years but reconciled before she passed away. Sarah said she was grateful for that time, however brief. I knew she had a point, but I also knew I wasn't ready to have my dad living with us. The idea still made me incredibly uncomfortable. Our home feels like a sanctuary, a place where I've finally found peace and stability. Having my dad there, with all the complicated emotions he brings up, feels like it would disrupt that peace. So, we came up with a compromise. We've started looking into assisted living facilities in our area. We found a few that seem nice and are within our budget. They offer private apartments, meals, social activities, and medical care if needed. The plan is to help Dad move into one of these places. We'll cover the initial costs and then help him figure out his finances so he can manage the ongoing expenses. This way, Dad will have a safe place to live with access to care if he needs it. And we can slowly rebuild our relationship, if that's what I decide I want, without the pressure of living together. It feels like a way to help him without completely upending our lives. I called Dad yesterday to explain our plan. He was quiet for a moment, then said he understood. He thanked us for being willing to help at all. I could hear the disappointment in his voice, but also relief. I think part of him was scared of living with us too, of having to face the consequences of his past actions every day. We're going to tour a couple of facilities next week. Dad seemed to perk up a bit when I mentioned that one place has a chess club. He used to love playing chess with his friends from work. It's a small thing, but it made me hopeful that he might be able to build a new life for himself, make some friends his own age. I'm still processing all of this. Part of me feels guilty for not doing more, while another part feels like this is already more than he deserves. I keep reminding myself that it's okay to have boundaries, that helping doesn't have to mean sacrificing my own well-being. Sarah and I have also decided to start couples therapy. We want to make sure we're on the same page as we navigate this new chapter. We've always communicated well, but this situation is bringing up a lot of complex emotions for both of us. I want to make sure we have the tools to support each other through whatever comes next. I'll post another update after we've gotten Dad settled. For now, I'm trying to take things one day at a time. Thank you again for all your advice and support. It's helped more than you know to have outside perspectives on this situation. Update 2. It's been about 2 months since my last update, and a lot has happened. I wanted to share how things have progressed. We toured several assisted living facilities with my dad. It was an emotional process. Seeing these places really drove home how much had changed and how much time had passed. Dad was quiet during most of the tours, but he seemed to perk up at one place in particular. It had a nice community garden and a weekly chess club, both things Dad used to enjoy. We decided on that facility and helped Dad move in about 6 weeks ago. Sarah and I covered the initial costs and the first month's fees. We also hired a financial advisor to help Dad sort out his finances. Turns out, he did have some assets left that he hadn't realized, an old 401k, and a small life insurance policy from his job. It's not a fortune, but it will help cover his expenses going forward. The moving process was complicated. Dad didn't have much to bring with him, which was sad in its own way. But as we were packing up his few belongings, we came across some old photo albums. There were pictures of me as a kid, school photos, even some of my college graduation that I didn't know he had. It hit me hard, realizing he'd kept these all this time. One photo in particular caught my eye. It was from a camping trip we took when I was about 8, just the two of us. I remembered that trip vividly, how Dad taught me to fish, how we roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories. For a moment, looking at that picture, I felt a wave of nostalgia for the relationship we used to have. We've been visiting Dad once a week since he moved in. At first, it was awkward. We'd sit in his small apartment, making stilted small talk about the weather or the food at the facility. But gradually, things have started to feel more natural. Last week, Dad asked if he could show us around the facility. As we walked, he pointed out his favorite spots: the library where he started reading again, the garden where he's volunteering. He introduced us to some of his new friends. Seeing him like this, more relaxed and engaged, was both nice and painful. Nice because he seemed happier. Painful because it highlighted how strained our own relationship still is. Sarah has been incredible through all of this. She's patient when I need to vent, and she's formed her own bond with Dad. Sometimes I think he opens up to her more easily than to me. Part of me is jealous, but mostly I'm grateful. She's been able to get information about his health and daily needs that he might be reluctant to share with me directly. As for me and Dad, we're working on it. We've had some difficult conversations about the past. He's apologized multiple times for how he treated me, for choosing Linda over me, for not reaching out sooner. I believe he's sincere, but it's hard to let go of the hurt. I've also opened up to him about what my life was like after he kicked me out. How scared and alone I felt. How hard I had to work just to survive. He listened without interrupting, tears in his eyes. When I finished, he said he wished he could go back and change everything. But since he can't, all he can do is try to be better now. It's a process. Some days are easier than others. Sometimes when I'm with him, I remember good times from my childhood, and I feel a warmth towards him. Other times, the old anger and resentment bubble up, and I have to take a step back. I'm working with a therapist to process all of this. It's helping me understand my own feelings better and figure out what kind of relationship I want with my dad moving forward. For now, we're taking it one day at a time. Dad seems to be settling in well at the facility. His health has improved a bit with regular meals and medical checkups. He's making friends and has even started talking about volunteering to teach a beginner's chess class. Sarah and I are doing okay too. This situation has brought up some tough conversations, but I think it's ultimately strengthened our relationship. She's shown me so much support and understanding through all of this. I don't know what the future holds for me and my dad. I'm not sure we'll ever have the close relationship we might have had if things had been different. But we're trying, and I guess that's what matters for now. Thank you all again for your advice and support. It's been a challenging few months, but I feel like we're on a better path now. Update 3. It's been about 6 months since my last update, and I wanted to share some significant developments in our situation. Dad has been living at the assisted living facility for 8 months now, and overall, it's been a positive change. He's settled into a routine and seems more at peace than I've seen him in years. He's teaching that chess class we talked about, and it's become quite popular among the residents. Our relationship has been slowly improving. We still have our awkward moments and occasional tensions, but we're communicating better. We've established a routine of weekly dinners, sometimes at the facility, sometimes at our house. These dinners have become a space for us to reconnect and rebuild our relationship. One evening, after dinner at our place, Dad asked to speak with me privately. He handed me an envelope, his hands shaking slightly. Inside was a letter he'd written, along with some legal documents. The letter was a more detailed apology than he'd given before. He acknowledged specific instances where he'd failed me as a father, from dismissing my concerns about Linda to the final confrontation that led to him kicking me out. He wrote about the regret and shame he'd carried all these years, and how proud he was of the man I'd become despite his failures. The legal documents were a surprise. Dad had consulted with a lawyer and had decided to sign over his remaining assets to me. It wasn't a huge amount. Some savings bonds, a small life insurance policy, and a few other investments. But it represented most of what he had left. I was conflicted about accepting this. On one hand, it felt like he was trying to buy forgiveness. On the other, I could see it was his way of trying to make amends, to give me the support he should have given years ago. After discussing it with Sarah and my therapist, I decided to accept the assets, but with a condition. I told Dad I'd use the money to set up a college fund for any future children Sarah and I might have. He seemed touched by this idea, saying he liked the thought of contributing to his potential grandchildren's future. This conversation led to another revelation. Sarah and I had been trying for a baby for a few months, but we hadn't told anyone yet. In that moment, it felt right to share the news with Dad. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. He hugged us both, tears in his eyes. The pregnancy news has added a new dimension to our rebuilding relationship. Dad has thrown himself into the role of expectant grandfather with enthusiasm. He's been reading parenting books and offering advice, some welcome, some less so. It's strange but heartwarming to see him so invested. There have been challenges too. As Dad's health has stabilized, he started talking about wanting to move out of the facility and into his own apartment. This has brought up a lot of complicated feelings for me. Part of me worries about him living alone, both for practical and emotional reasons. Another part is anxious about him becoming too dependent on us. We've had some tense conversations about this. I've had to set clear boundaries about what kind of support we can offer. It's been difficult, but I think it's important for both of us. Dad seems to be coming to terms with the idea that he needs to maintain some independence. Sarah has been my rock through all of this. Her pregnancy has been relatively smooth so far, but it still added stress to our lives. Balancing her needs, my dad's situation, and my own emotions has been challenging. We've continued with couples therapy, which has been incredibly helpful in navigating these changes. One unexpected positive has been reconnecting with my step-siblings. They reached out after hearing about Dad's situation and our reconciliation. It turns out they had their own complicated relationships with their mother, my former stepmother, and had distanced themselves from her years ago. We've had some good conversations, sharing our experiences and finding common ground. It's nice to feel like I have a broader support system now. As we look to the future, I'm cautiously optimistic. The impending arrival of our baby has given us all something positive to focus on. Dad talks about wanting to be a better grandfather than he was a father, and I want to believe he means it. I'm still working through my own feelings about everything that's happened. There are days when the old resentments flare up, but they're becoming less frequent. I'm learning to appreciate the relationship we're building now without forgetting the past. Thank you all for your continued support and advice throughout this journey. It's been a long, complicated road, but I feel like we're moving in the right direction. I'll update again after the baby arrives and we see how this new chapter unfolds.